All right, I want to make a short presentation about uh, economic growth and the business cycle and unemployment. Now, economic growth is either an increase in real GDP over some time period or an increase in real GDP per capita over some time period. You might think, well, isn't that the same thing? Well, no, fluctuations in the population can mean those two numbers don't track necessarily together, but yeah, they're obviously very related. Let's see. Why is this good? Why are we constantly talking? Why are politicians constantly talking about the need for economic growth? Because it produces a higher standard of living. China today has a vastly higher standard of living than it did 30 years ago because of their incredible economic growth. Growth reduces the burden of scarcity. We can't get rid of scarcity. That's the basic economic fact, but you can make it less severe and improve human well-being. Here is a history of U.S. growth since the mid-20th century. Starting in 1950, real GDP was about 1.8 trillion, 11 trillion in 2005. It's about 18, 19 trillion today. Now, that's a growth rate of that time period of 3.5%. Real GDP per capita only grew at a rate of 2.3%. That's still very healthy because our population exploded. But that's a really impressive number because the United States became the world's largest economy about 1910. By itself, the U.S. is almost a quarter of the entire world's economy. So when you're that big, it's hard to get bigger. But that 3.5% growth rate is pretty robust. Now, so the general trend is up. Obviously, it's not steadily straight up. It's more like a roller coaster. There are peaks and valleys. Four parts to the business cycle. A peak, where GDP is, and therefore income, has reached a temporary maximum. A recession is a period of decline in GDP. That's what a recession by definition is. A depression is simply a really bad recession. The trough is the bottoming out of the business cycle. You want to hit the trough. You want to hit bottom so you can stop falling and start recovering. An expansion, also called a recovery, or a period where GDP and income are rising. Now, of our three macroeconomic measures we're learning about in this module, inflation, GDP, and unemployment. Unemployment is the simplest, but students sometimes get confused. This is a picture, by the way, of unemployment in 2005. And the way it's calculated is that economists start by putting every American in one of four boxes. Box number one is under 16 and/or institutionalized. Why 16 years of age? Well, because at 16 you can drive, and so many people over 16 work. Many of you listening to me work, and people sometimes work before age 16, but not nearly as many, and so that's our arbitrary cutoff point. Institutionalized means people that can't work, can't be in the labor force because they're in an institution. Unfortunately, in America, the biggest bulk of that are people in prison. Also, the American military complex is counted in that. You're thinking, well, that doesn't make sense because, people in the armed forces, they have a job. Yes, they do, but they're not employed in the civilian economic sector. So we count them in this box. Next, we have not in the labor force. These are people who, they're over 16. They're not institutionalized, and so they could work, but they choose not to. Who are these people? Well, a large number of them are stay-at-home moms or stay-at-home dads. They're also retired people who certainly can work, and many do. You'd be surprised how many do, but most don't. And some of these people are simply financially independent. You have enough money, you don't have to work. Must be nice. All right, so the final two boxes comprise together the labor force, the employed and the unemployed. These are people who either want a job or have a job. So the unemployment rate is not the percent of the population that's unemployed. That would overstate it. It's the percentage of the labor force that's unemployed. So you see, it's a very simple calculation. You take the unemployed and divide by the labor force. Now, this number is very important, but we have to measure apples to apples and keep a number going forward. But it's not perfect. It sort of understates the problem for two particular reasons. One is part-time employees are considered employed. But as you know, there are people who sometimes have part-time jobs because they can't get a full-time job. But so they're underemployed. But according to this metric, they're fine. There's no problem there. Secondly, you have discouraged workers. Let me back up here. So let's say I'm 61 years old, the Great Recession hits, and I lose my job. And I need to find a job. But it's very difficult for a 61-year-old professional to find a job in corporate America, as you can imagine. And so I decided I'm just going to go ahead and retire. I don't feel like I can afford to retire. I don't want to retire, but I'm going to do that anyway. So I'm removing myself from the labor force. I'm going to go into box 2, not in labor force. But I'd rather be employed. I'm what's known as a discouraged worker. Another example is, let's say I'm a stay-at-home mom. My kids get to a certain age and I want to go work. I have skills, but I can't find a job that pays much more than my transportation and daycare cost. So I'm just going to continue to be a stay-at-home mom. So I'm a discouraged worker. So none of these discouraged workers, unemployment is reflected in the unemployment rate because they're not in the labor force, but they might want to be. So for these two reasons, unemployment tends to be a little bit understated by this number, but it's an important consistent number. Now, there are three kinds of unemployment. The first is frictional unemployment. Think of two jobs rubbing together, rubbing up against each other and creating friction. This is unemployment from people who are searching for jobs or waiting to take jobs in the near future, or someone who quits working in a bank to go work at another bank. So it's either two jobs or a job and a training gig rubbing up against each other. And it's good, actually. This kind of unemployment is good because you want people to be constantly moving to a higher and better use for their skills. For this reason, unemployment is never zero, by the way. The second kind is structural unemployment. And this means that something changes in taste or culture or technology have altered either the occupational or the geographic structure of the demand for labor. For example, a robot begins doing my job. I am structurally unemployed because of technology that has changed the occupational structure of the demand for labor. Or I'm a textile worker, and all the textile companies have moved to China, where it's much more cheaper to produce textiles. And I used to make socks in Fort Payne, Alabama, but now I'm unemployed. I am structurally unemployed because of a geographic structural change in the demand for labor. So the industry moves or undergoes some sort of technological change, structural unemployment. The third is the most pernicious kind of unemployment, cyclical unemployment. And that's unemployment from changes in the business cycle. It's easy to remember. It's got the name cycle in the title. And so if depression hits and people are buying fewer cars, so the car factory lays people off, they are cyclically unemployed. Lastly, I'd said that because of frictional, and really with globalization and constant technological change, I don't foresee any time in the future where there won't be structural unemployment. So frictional and structural unemployment are with us, even with healthy economies. So the unemployment rate is never zero. Each country has what's known as a natural rate of unemployment. The economy is good. It's producing its potential output, at its potential output, but there's still a rate of unemployment. This is called the natural rate. And the natural rate for the United States is about 5.3%. Current unemployment, by the way, is 5.5%. However, that's great news because in 2010 it was 10%, the worst since the Great Depression. But there was a period in the last 12 months where it was below 5%, so it can certainly go below the natural rate. So why is it higher now? I thought the economy was gathering strength. It is, but the improving economy has pulled discouraged workers back into the labor force. So in that sense, a rise in the unemployment rate is not necessarily a bad thing. And that is the story of unemployment.